So I'm very pleased to welcome Jill Lepore here to Politics and Prose tonight. Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University and a staff writer at The New Yorker. Her previous books include Joel Gold's Teeth, The Secret History of Wonder Woman, which I highly recommend, and The Book of Ages, among many, many others. Although Lepore examines all her subjects with rigorous research, graceful prose, and meticulous footnotes, these truths involves applying that same rigor and understanding not just to one subject, but many. The entire span of American history, in fact. Lepore places truth at the center of her book, specifically the truth of whether America has lived up to the Jeffersonian truths of political equality, natural rights, and the sovereignty of the people. To answer this question, Lepore not only covers a variety of topics, both timeless and current, but examines a variety of Americans, both well-known and lesser-known. Robert Dallek, author of Franklin D. Roosevelt, writes, "In this time of disillusionment with American politics, Jill Lepore's beautifully written book should be essential reading for everyone who cares about the country's future. Her history of the United States reminds us of the dilemmas that have plagued the country and the institutional strengths that have allowed us to survive as a republic for over 2 centuries. At a minimum, her book should be required reading for every federal office holder." Now, please join me in welcoming Jill Lepore.
Thanks so much. I thought I was going to get to speak from the Alistair Cook chair up here. Or also the Alistair Cookie Monster chair, if anyone remembers the Sesame Street send-up of Masterpiece Theater. It's really lovely to be here. I wish I was watching the Red Sox beat the Yankees right now. But I have only 24 hours to wait for that auspicious history-making moment. Thank you very much. I have some slides, and I apologize for people in the back if they're hard to see. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. But what I thought I would try to do, and I thought about trying to do book talks about this 900-page, 7-century-long extravaganza, and you can't really kind of pick a moment and just talk about it. So I thought I would give a little slideshow that tries to make the case that it's important to think about the whole sweep of American history. The reason I wrote this book, and I say this in the book, is that I feel that we are kind of trapped in the prison of the present. I did start writing this book before the present. People are like, "When? You must have started just reading." I'm like, "No, it takes a while to write a book like this." I started writing this book a while ago, but I felt this way for a long time, that we're so busy keeping up with a moment-by-moment news feed. It's very hard to understand the longer history of contemporary problems. And that's the spirit in which I wrote the book. And so I want to show you some slides that I think at least offer that same spirit, right, of looking over a very long view, looking at a lot of things that stretch along a long timeline. But I also want to say that that way that we live now is we live in a politics in which all of our political conversations are historical arguments. They're just really condensed, reductivist historical arguments, and they can't really be subjected to inquiry or challenged unless we have a much better understanding of the past. And I don't mean this as a right-left thing. All of our arguments politically make historical claims, make assertions about the relationship between the past and the present. Whether it is that Obama is a betrayal of George Washington as here, or whether Obama represents change that we can believe in, is looking forward, or whether we want to argue that change, in fact, should be stopped as here. My sympathies lie with the guy who made this poster. Just want to be clear, this is my partisan position. So what I want to do to try to illustrate this for you, which is what do you see when you look across the centuries instead of looking at 4-word slogans? Well, what you see is a whole reorientation of how humans regard one another and regard the world in which we live. And I want to show you that by looking at how people represented and have represented the idea of the United States and how that's changed over time. So, of course, all peoples represent graphically their relationship to the world. This is this incredibly beautiful Aztec representation of the world and man's place in it, the man at the center here of this illustration that shows the sort of points of the compass. Native peoples of the Americas, like the Algonquin Powhatans, made representations of their political arrangements. Here is the leader of the Powhatans. This is Pocahontas's father. Powhatan is the male figure here, surrounded by his spirit guides, and the circles, which are these, there's all this shell work on deerskin, represent all the peoples that pay tribute to Powhatan. This is a map of his realm, for instance. Europeans at the time that Columbus made his voyage in 1492 often shared this view of the relationship of the peoples of the world. That is, the world was divided into three parts: Europe, Africa, and Asia, here labeled after as well the three sons of Noah, that the world had been divided into three parts and descended from three peoples. This representation is medieval. This is a 17th century map. It was the first map ever printed. It was printed in 1472, just after a couple of decades after the printing press. 2 decades later, it was obsolete, and map makers kind of had a field day trying to figure out how to represent the previously unknown fourth part of the world. And the Americas were for a long time simply referred to as the fourth part of the world, because people in Europe had understood, in Africa and in Asia had understood the world as having only three parts. This map maker was trying to be as up-to-date as possible. You can see at the last minute, like, oh no, we have to round the Cape of Good Hope, because it turns out you could sail around the bottom of Africa, and added this green landmass here, the fourth part of the world, which is indescribable. And he didn't know what to put on it by way of a label, but he'd read a book by the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, and so he called this land America. That is the first visual representation of the idea of America. America then becomes, to European allegorists like this Dutch engraver, a naked native woman. This is Amerigo Vespucci here, this man, this engraving called Awakening a Sleeping America. America represented as a naked woman, a naked indigenous woman, becomes a common conceit. I like to think of Vespucci as the Harvey Weinstein of the Age of Discovery. You can see what's going on here. We'll come back to this, because the raping of America is also a common conceit. Here's a very different representation of a ruler's relationship to place. This is Queen Elizabeth. It may be hard for you in the back to see, but she's got her hand on the globe, and her palm is just seizing North America. At a time when North America was inhabited by indigenous peoples and claimed by Spain. So England has no possessions in North America, but Queen Elizabeth would like to think that it does. We are many of us familiar with this woodcut that appears in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. We often think of this as a political cartoon urging that the colonies, the British mainland colonies, to unite in common defense, but it's also a map. You forget, north is to your right. This is a map of the British American colonies as well. Here's a British image of the raping of America. America here, a naked native woman, as has become conventional, being raped by stamp collectors. This is during the coercive acts. This is what Britain was now doing to America instead of Amerigo Vespucci. The Constitution is a representation of the idea of the United States, of course. It is the embodiment. The people are instantiated. Our frame of government is embodied in this piece of paper, and that is distributed for all of us to hold and to read. And the very reading of it brings us into a political community. But from the very earliest days of the Republic, the limitations of that community's understanding of freedom and of rights, the limitations of its understanding of who the people are, those truths that Katie mentioned, those three truths on which Americans declared their independence, were always called into question, always in conversation. Here, America has become Liberty, Lady Liberty. She's no longer a native. She's got clothes, and she is here encountering slavery. And this is an indictment of the United States' continuation of slavery. The representation of the United States as a land of hypocrisy is a very deep and long-standing part of the graphic arts in the United States. Here's Thomas Jefferson as a philosophic cock, that is to say, a cock who is a philosopher, with Sally Hemings, the woman who was his property, by whom he had several children, as we now know. This is from 1804. It's not new for people to observe that the United States is both a land of liberty and a land of slavery, and that is an ongoing part of conversation and of our American politics. This is one of the more interesting representations of the idea of the nation. This is the American hotel. And what's fascinating about it, you can see the sign over the porch says the American Hotel with an eagle. And on the porch are white men of every rank and station, of every ethnicity, of different wealth. Some are from the town, some are from the country. There are farmers, there are gentlemen, there are bankers. This would have been legible to people at the time. This is the great celebration of American democracy. All white men could vote. This was called universal suffrage in the age of Andrew Jackson, because nowhere else in the world could even the poor vote. It's an extraordinary democratization in the United States. This is also an indictment of the limits of that vision. It's a little bit hard to see, but leaning out of the window, not on the porch, is a white woman who is craning her ear, trying desperately to be a part of this conversation, reading the news, thinking about politics. And on the front steps of that porch, not up on the porch, not allowed on the porch, is a black man and his son or daughter who are dressed to indicate that they are slaves in this image. But one of the things that's so subversive about this image, it's that black man and his child who are in red, white, and blue. It is their country. The convention of dividing the United States into states that would be colored depending on their political persuasion is a feature of the United States in the last years before the Civil War. Our electoral college map on CNN that you see on election night is the product of the division of the Union during the Civil War into free states and slave states, and here in green, the unorganized territory. This, I think, is one of the most powerful images of the idea of America. I'm worried you guys can't see. This is Sojourner Truth, a famous abolitionist, former slave. She's knitting. And can you see what she's knitting? It's Maine up here in the center of her lap, and follow the coastline down to the Florida Peninsula. Come up to Louisiana, there's Texas. She's knitting the country. It's not just a claim to citizenship. I am a citizen. I am free. I made this country with my hands. This is my country. I built this place. One of the most powerful visual representations of the idea of America. Much that it surfaces in our politics today has, of course, ancient roots, including the idea that the country has a wall, or should have a wall. This would have been the wall in California, represented here, the very first federal law restricting immigration in 1881, the Chinese Exclusion Act. Here, much derided by suggesting that at the time that the Chinese are actually taking down their Great Wall, other American ethnic groups are erecting a wall on the coast of the. Meanwhile, that Lady Liberty that we saw, that's a kind of dressed up version of the Native American woman, becomes iconic, at the same time celebrating the degree to which the United States remains open to immigrants, except for Chinese. There's a whole series of beautiful folk art that represents the idea of America. This is a suffrage quilt in which all these names that have been so carefully embroidered on this flag are people who have supported suffrage. It's a testament to the claim for equal rights for women. Populism has representations in American graphic arts, often much derided by elites. Populism in the 19th century was left populism. Populism only moved to the right in the 20th century. We have a lot of iconography in our world today, including, the game of Monopoly, that it comes from the era of indicting the plutocrats, which is another way of representing the problem of America and the problem of our political arrangements. Graphic representations that borrow from that Lady Liberty or from the Naked America become a feature of suffrage cartooning in the 19-teens, where America is represented as a woman who is tied up and bound, often kept in chains, because women are slaves to men without the right to vote. The anxiety of mass democracy in the age of mass production finds its representation in images like this of Henry Ford's early factory. A metaphor that we do not use today, but I suppose could, comes from the great age of immigration restriction in the 1920s. Here is the idea of the funnel, that what the United States really ought to have at its borders is a funnel. This leads to the eugenics-based National Origins Act of 1924. The idea that the United States is a superpower emerges from, it finds its representation graphically in comic books. Captain America debuts in 1940, Wonder Woman in 1941, representing the idea that America in this new era will be a nation above all other nations. At the same time, the United States is failing to confront with the continuation of racial oppression in the form of Jim Crow, which has led to the vast migration of African Americans from the Jim Crow South, fleeing racial violence and racial terrorism to the north and to the west, depicted here in this beautiful painting by Jacob Lawrence that looks to me a little bit like a continent. It has a sense of manifest destiny and millions of African Americans who just picked up and went in the largest migration in American history. What we think of as that big turn in the 20th century is from that imperialism of Queen Elizabeth with her hand on North America to this FDR kind of atlas-like about to take on the globe, thinking about forming the United Nations, thinking about the United States' role in assuring the safety of liberal governments and a liberal world order, free markets, open borders, the rule of law in nations in the post-war period, through what FDR calls the arsenal of democracy, American military might. Out of that same war comes the technology that you have in your pocket and doubtless are tempted to check at this very minute, that is acceleration of all features of politics, among other things, through being able to sort and classify people instantly through the first mainframe computers, which are built during the Second World War and are first used to predict the outcome of a presidential election in 1952. America, in this representation, is that piece of printout. That is us. That is where we are represented here. The people that were on that Constitution, that are under that hotel porch, we are now on this piece of paper spewing out of a printer. This printer spewing out here, these are MIT engineers with Atlas on their shoulders in the age of Sputnik. Increasingly, the idea that our political problems, our role in the world, all these things can be solved by more and faster development of computational technology becomes a feature of the federal government's commitment to the basic premise of knowledge, which engenders a lot of dispute and I think kind of beautiful, tragic art that goes against the sorting and automation of the population in the age of computers. This beautiful Jasper Johns or dripping, gooey map of the United States. Or this is a silkscreen protest, anti-Vietnam War protest flag. Really a very powerful representation of the United States in all of its complexity, which is answered, of course, by the age of the bumper sticker that we live in now. We can think about that notion being challenged by the environmental movement and its very different depiction of the world and what it means to think of living on a world back to that globe that Elizabeth was holding, and what it means to think about the world in environmental terms and not in territorial or political ones. One of the most beautiful pieces of artwork, this is a piece of folk art to come out of the bicentennial, an African-American quilter from Alabama, which really beautifully is a bicentennial celebration, but also prefigures what we would sort of call the Rainbow Coalition. It's not of that moment. It really predates that rainbow icon, but it's quite a beautiful hand-sewn quilt. When I get to this point when I lecture American history, I always just say, this is the representation of the American people between 1968 and 2000. And I want to kind of communicate to you how deeply we think about ourselves quantitatively. All that computational speed and capacity, the rise of the social sciences, the decline of humanistic ways of understanding ourselves in relationship to others, means that in some way in our heads we carry this chart, this very compelling chart around with us, and it asks us a lot of questions. It starts in 1947 on the left on the x-axis and ends in 2012 on the x-axis. What we're charting in blue is the Gini Index, which is a measure of income inequality. So between 1947 and about 1972, income inequality is very low. It's the lowest it's ever been in American history. That is largely because of the GI Bill, which leads to unprecedented economic growth, but also unprecedented income equality. And what we're charting in red here is the polarization of the two political parties, which is measured in this index by House polarization. That is roll call votes taken in the floor of Congress that are keyed and coded in very elaborate ways. But what you see there too, how political polarization between the end of the Second World War and about 1972 is very low, again, as low as it's ever been in American history. And like income inequality has been rising ever since. So the reason I show this slide when I teach American history and I get to this point is it's a kind of quick way of like turning it on the audience and saying, what is going on here? Like what accounts for how closely these two things track one another. Are we divided because income inequality is widening? Is income inequality widening because we're so divided and we have such policy gridlock? What is the relationship between the two trends that are being charted here? What do they explain? What do they not explain? If you were going to add something else that you might want to chart here, another factor, what would it be? How would we get to the bottom of this? As a matter of investigation, how would we get to the bottom of this? And I guess I would just posit that it is our obligation, all of us, to try to get to the bottom of this. This isn't going to be solved by social scientists. The people who did think they could solve it were the people who argued that the internet should be open to commercial traffic and entirely deregulated, unregulated, and essentially a Wild West. The people who started Wired Magazine in 1993 and claimed that the internet would solve all of those problems, income inequality, polarization, every other problem on the face of the earth, because it would connect us all. And if we were only connected by wires, we would be as one. I know it's funny. Especially if you go read the old issues. You either laugh or you cry. But the old issues of Wired Magazine are some of the saddest reading I did in the course of this book, I will just tell you. And I read some pretty ugly stuff. Where I have found the most poignant statements about the nature of the United States representationally are in pieces of public art. This is an incredibly powerful work at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. You guys have probably seen it, by the Korean-American artist Namjoon Paik. It's about the size of this wall. It's a giant neon United States. I did a disservice to Alaska and Hawaii. They are also there. But every state is composed of a series of screens that are broadcasting. They're broadcasting stuff loosely about their state, really at top volume. So as you far away, it's just really, really a mess, and you can't really, it's just a lot of noise. And the closer you get, the more it is just a mess and just a lot of noise. And you can maybe, if you try really hard, hear one thing, you go to Oklahoma and you hear, Oklahoma, where the wind, and you hear just that, but then something else blurts over it. And then you go to Massachusetts and you might hear I got the horse right here, his name is Paul Revere. But what you mainly take away from this is everybody in the United States is broadcasting at top volume, and no one is listening to what anyone else is saying. So it's a very compelling piece of work. So to get us near to the present then, to remind you where I began, which is how much we use history to make political arguments. And of course, that's a natural thing to do, but I think we would make better arguments and be able to understand other people's arguments better if we had some notion of a shared past. We see all this stuff. Historians all the time look out into the world and see it's just the world is on constant rerun. There's a lot of things everyone will say, this is unprecedented, that is unprecedented, this is unprecedented. A lot of things are precedented. Including our electoral map, but I already foreshadowed this. But I think it's important to think about the ways in which even our graphic representations of the United States are doing political work. They are actually working to divide us, right? The way that we have chosen to represent the United States graphically in our media world insists on our divisions. I was talking to a woman the other night who was telling me she had been on a hiking and canoeing trip, and she was from New Hampshire. And in the course of this week-long super rugged trip, she learned that everybody else who had signed up from the trip was on the same line of, it's latitude that goes this way? Was on the same line of latitude, all the way across to Montana. And they all liked the same kind of rafting trip. And I was I want to think about my latitude as I don't want to think about my state for a little while or the color of my state. I want to think about my latitude. What do we have in common in other ways we might divide the country up or think about the nation? So I just want to end with this beautiful piece of work by the African-American artist Glenn Ligon, Double America. It's one of many that he made, trying to represent the very troubling notion that what many of us think is absolutely true, many of us think is just as absolutely untrue, and what it means to live in a culture in which we can live in the same place and inhabit the same country and not be able to agree on basic truths. Thanks very much. I didn't even understand.
Thank you. That was great. Do you talk about the New Deal in your book? And what happened to it?
Uh-huh.
I mean, I remember, I was born in 1947,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember how excited we all were. My father had been in the war, they had survived the Great Depression,
Right.
and there was the GI Bill, and things looked up for the first time in a long time, and the nation felt very united because everybody was in the war,
Yeah.
or everybody knew someone who was
Yeah.
in the war, and many people lost someone in the war,
Yeah.
and it didn't matter where you were on the
Right.
economic scale.
Right.
And there was a just optimism about progress.
Right.
We were just going to keep going in the same direction,
Yeah.
and we've gone in the opposite direction.
Yeah. Oh, that's a lovely question. Thank you for that. Yeah. It wouldn't be a good book if I skipped over the New Deal. I spent a lot of time on the New Deal. There's a chapter on the 1930s that is on the New Deal. When I get to the moment that you're talking about, the book is divided into 4 parts. And part four begins in 1946 and goes to 2016, and it's called The Machine. And it offers a technological, partly technological explanation. But of course, historians have for a long time debated when did the New Deal really die.
1968.
And it becomes a sort of silly argument. Because some people said it died in 1936. Like there were all kinds of problems with that, the kind of midterm elections, and then some people say, Obama was the New Deal, and there's a very wide range of explanation. I spent a lot of time thinking about Truman's administration and the Fair Deal, and one of the things that I do there is I spend a lot of time talking about. Actually, Earl Warren, who was governor of California. Earl Warren had very bad kidney infection and almost died. And he decided in 1945 that he's, very conservative Republican governor of California. And he thinks, you know what, actually, turns out I think the New Deal was a good idea. And the one thing we didn't really get accomplished was national health insurance. But this experience of nearly dying of kidneys, he had grown up dirt poor. And he's like, I think that if anybody else aside from me had this, you would just die because you couldn't afford this medical care. So I'm going to get legislation passed in California for statewide insurance, health insurance. And he is unsuccessful because the very first political consulting firm in the history of the world, which is called Campaigns Inc., wages a completely terrifying campaign to defeat. They're hired by the California MA or whatever. Anyway, then when Truman, he says, look, we're going to have, Warren's got the right idea. This is before it's defeated. We're going to have a national health insurance. That's going to be the signature element of my Fair Deal. I'm going to realize what FDR set in motion. Like, none of this crap about how this is socialism. Don't give me that. This is a thing that, like, every other country has. We really need this. Even Earl Warren thinks we need this. Then the AMA hires the same political consultants that defeated Warren's plan to engage in a national campaign. The reason they're successful is because they're using the new rhetoric of the Cold War, which is just, the Cold by 1949, because what's going on in China and the Soviet Union, what's going on with Stalin and Mao, what's gone on with warnings about espionage, Truman's political capital has really diminished. And the political argument that Campaigns Inc. is able to use really turns that tide. So I that doesn't fully answer your question. It's just to say, there's fun stories in the book about this.
I have read your book, and I think it's wonderful, and I hope everybody here reads it.
Well, thank you.
When you read a book like this, you try to figure, well, where is the author? Where, right, left, up, down, and you can't tell from the book. And I won't ask you now. But
thank you. That's very good to hear. That was intentional.
In the early part of the book, references made to Abigail Adams, who said to her husband, who was in the process of drafting the Constitution, remember the ladies. And now we have the last 2 or 3 weeks. And if you were
we'll
still...
forget them in about 48 hours.
Yeah. If you were still writing the book and hadn't finished it yet, would you include it? And if so, where? Where would it connect?
Oh, where would I put the Me Too movement? Yeah, so the book ends on Election Day in 2016, very abruptly. Because I had intended to end it in 2009, and I had to make a kind of last-minute adjustment. One of the problems with how we think about the past, about the American past, that I try to remedy in the book is not having women just appear and make little cameo appearances, and Abigail Adams says her thing, and then it's 1848, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton comes out and does a curtsy, and then it's 1920 and Carrie Chapman Catt says, "We won the right to vote," and then it's 1963 and Betty Friedan writes a screed from her kitchen table, and then it's 1972 and we get to see Gloria Steinem, on talking to William F. Buckley, and then the end. Little cameo appearances of women in a book that's really all about men gets us to where we are now, where there's never really been a political settlement around equal rights for women. There's never been an understanding of women's role in American political history. I think the Washington Press Corps, I don't think, has understood it in its long, distinguished history. I don't think political historians have ever understood the political role of women. How I talk about the political role of women in American history is during all those decades when women did not have the right to vote. They engaged in a kind of politics that we have forgotten that they founded, which is the moral crusade. Because all that women could really do is say, you, Mr. Guy, have to go vote the way I'm going to tell you to vote. And I'm going to tell you to vote because I actually know about this, because I have moral authority over you, because I actually have a better sense of the right and wrong way to think about these vulnerable people, women and children in particular. That's how abolition was waged. That's how the temperance movement was waged. That's how prohibition was waged. That is how the pro-life movement has been waged. Moral crusades became a foundational part of the American political style, not always waged by women, but they're waged outside of the political arena. Even after women got the right to vote, they continued to wage moral crusades, and then so did men. The campaign to stop the ERA that Phyllis Schlafly led was a moral crusade. Me Too is a moral crusade, and people engage in moral crusades when the laws don't work. Women are not equally protected by the laws against sexual violence, sexual assault, and sexual harassment. That's a way that I would understand that movement historically. There's not really much more that can be said about it without knowing where it's going. But what a historian can do is say, well, this is where that comes from.
This summer, I went to the memorial and museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that memorializes all the people who were lynched. And I wondered how much of your book talks about the Great American Crime. And what was so profound for me was here was at Montgomery, Alabama, that had a large city block area devoted to this memorial, and wondered how your book weaves that through.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time talking about lynching. I spent a lot of time talking about Ida B. Wells. I spent a lot of time talking about Du Bois's. The question was about lynching and the place of lynching in my account. So I spent a lot of time talking about lynching. I spent a lot of time talking about FDR's unwillingness to sign anti-lynching legislation in the 1930s. But I spent a lot of time with race in general throughout the book, because we have an unfortunately kind of racially segregated history, like where we think that politics is what happens in the White House and in the Capitol, and everything else is a social movement, and they don't need to be considered together. The history tells us that you cannot understand politics without understanding social movements and protest movements all together. So it's not so much chronicling the terror of lynching. I spend a lot of time chronicling the courage of the campaign to end lynching.
Thank you. This is a wonderful talk. Makes me want to take every course you've ever offered. I've
just given you all of them in like one.
I think that just to follow up on the women and lynching, the two of the greater crimes of our country. I look on it as who's in the room when it happens, and if white men are writing the law and the Constitution, then everybody who isn't a white man is other and is different and has to be dealt with differently, and that underlies all of it. And I think that you present that sort of viewpoint, not explicitly, but that really runs through your work, which I really appreciate the ongoing theme of it. I'm wondering, in light of the first question about World War II and the elation that followed. The Depression is over. We have the GI Bill. We have the economic equality for a while. It makes me think a bit about Wag the Dog and the notion that if you have a war, if you unite against a common enemy, then that's a method of unifying people. And I think about the wars that we have fought in the past 50 years, none of which was declared. And the most recent being the war on terrorism since 9/11 and all of the divisiveness that has raised. And I'm wondering whether you see I'm wondering why that has been such a different sort of war in your view, and what you think might be. I'm not asking you to suggest an invasion of some country, but what might be unifying.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for that. It's a rich question. You need to read the book. It's too big of a question to answer to your satisfaction, and I don't want to answer it in a reductivist way. But so I'm going to just take that last part about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the sort of ongoing global war against terror declared, in September of 2001. What that war has, what distinguishes those wars from Vietnam, especially from Vietnam, is the lack of shared sacrifice, certainly from World War II, right? It's the lack of the draft. Almost nobody in Congress has sacrificed a child, or them at this point, a large number have not served. I mean, Eisenhower famously said, I shudder for the country when someone who has not seen the atrocity of war occupies this office. George H.W. Bush was the last president to have served in combat, and it shows. It really shows. Can't give you polling data, but many Americans have no idea that we've been engaged in these wars, or what their costs have been. They're waged by the poor, who in a sense work as drones for the rest of us, and the people don't even know what's going on and have not been asked to make a sacrifice. There's so much less. There's just no remote possibility that is a unifying experience. The idea that 9/11 was a unifying experience turns out to be a national myth as well. That was like for about 6 hours.
I was going to say 30 seconds.
It's a very troubling. The last chapter of the book starts on 9/11 and goes to Election Day 2016. So that's why I was sort of saying read the book. I spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I work at the National Museum of American History and Education, and one of the questions we try to ask people frequently is, what should good citizens do? So can you speak to how the idea of what good citizens do has changed over time?
Well, the citizenry has chiefly changed, right? I mean, that's the most significant piece of the evolution of the idea of citizenship. Who has the capacity for citizenship has changed, and the sad reflection that you might offer about that is that the broader our understanding of citizenship has become, the less our expectations for citizenry. So that when you see mass democracy in the 20th century emerge, you also see politics become not the work of party bosses and cajoling and drinking at the tavern, but the work of mass persuasion. What citizens are asked to do is consume political ideas as a commodity that is brought to them through leaflets or at their door. We ask less and less of citizens each generation by way of independent scrutiny of the affairs of state. The bigger the electorate gets, the less we ask of the electorate. It's something I don't have like a good educator answer for you. I have a very of a lamentation.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm a journalist, so I know how hard it is during the editing process when you have to get rid of your children. So I was wondering if there's a part in this 900-page book that you didn't end up getting into the pages, so some story that you cherished but maybe just didn't fit in.
Oh yeah, no, I spent a lot of sleepless nights. Like, oh, I can't believe I can't use this. I love this part. For me, honestly, it's largely like stuff I couldn't put in the footnotes. I'm like a footnote freak. Although it's funny that you mentioned that. I always say like telling a person that like she has admirable footnotes is like liking a girl for her personality or something. Like it's like such a sly insult. Yeah, so a lot of it is actually citation to the work, like this incredible work of scholars for the last half century. The thing that structurally I had to leave out that I was disappointed by, I made a decision that the book is relentlessly chronological, and I also wrote it very fast with the idea that would help the book have pace as you read it, that you want to keep going. And so it's very plot driven because of the chronology is the gravity of the story. And yet it's also very character focused because I'm trying to help people to see that there's Benjamin Franklin, but there's also his sister Jane, and put them in the same page and have both people in power and people who seemingly don't have power but are actually deeply influencing our political order on the same page. So when you have all of American history and you want to have a lot of plot and a lot of plot details and a lot of plotting, like a lot of foreshadowing and calling back and like literary devices, and you have a lot of character sketches, the thing that I basically had to let go of, in fact, I put a lot of it in and I pulled it out, were like a sense of place. Like we never are on a street in Wyoming. We're never on a beach in Hawaii. We're never standing in San Francisco when, the railroad arrives. We don't hear the noise of cows being rushed to slaughter in Chicago. Like there's nothing. There's no place. It's like, it could be anywhere. And I couldn't, it would have been another 1,000 pages. And I just couldn't do, and it made me really sad because I loved that kind of I love doing that kind of scene setting. And also there's a kind of work around like, it is a beautiful country, that I wanted there to be there. And I just couldn't. Now I'm very sad. Between the citizenry disappointing me and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Hi, I just am wondering about the sort of how the book addresses the gutting of public education in this country.
Not as well as it should. My objective here is to do an instructive act, to commit an act of instruction, to commit an act of education. My parents are both public school teachers, and my kids all go to public schools. Like I have very strong views about this matter as a citizen and as a historian. It's not front and center. I wrote a long New Yorker piece last month about the right to an education as a constitutional matter. It's something I try to address in the public sphere. There are a lot of other issues I really care about that I try to address as a historian. I talk about, and I frame the book around the idea of inquiry. The inquiry is an American value that, like equality, the country is founded on an Enlightenment idea and a commitment to inquiry. And in my own view, the idea of education as a constitutional matter was so fundamental that it isn't bothered to be written down in some way. Like you cannot be a citizen of a republic and not be educated. Like it's nonsense. So I touch on it here and there. I talk about restrictions. Historically, girls were not taught to write until the 19th century. It was a wrong idea to teach a girl to write. She might become impudent. It was illegal to teach slaves to read throughout the 19th century before emancipation. I talk a lot about historical forms of education discrimination. The 20th century piece of things, the kind of gutting of the California State University system, how conservatives, that last kind of 40 years, it doesn't have a place on my account.
Red Sox play the Yankees tomorrow night. You're safe for the time being.
I know. Red Sox will beat the Yankees tomorrow night.
American Heritage Magazine used to have a feature called Overrated and Underrated. Did any particular character grow in your estimation or diminish in your estimation while you wrote this?
Yes. Yes. I want to say that Alexander Hamilton grew in my estimation, but that's only an indication of how low Alexander Hamilton was in my estimation previously. Early 20th century fundamentalists grew in my estimation by a huge leap. I came to respect and understand fundamentalism as a critique of the atrocity of the modern world in a way that was really illuminating to me. Yeah, those are my two.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could say something about the role of immigrants in American history. You did mention, you talked about the anti-immigration fervor in the 1920s. And so I'm looking at the hostility to immigrants today. Do you think that this period is going to end? Is there going to be a time when immigrants and refugees are going to be welcome in this country again?
I kind of do. Yeah, it's a very, very, very long story. One of the things that's really interesting, one of the most radical things about the Constitution, the Revolution was radical, the Constitution is conservative, is how we kind of in a shorthand way understand those two things. Like, the Constitution was necessary because a lot of people thought the Revolution had gone too far. But one of the most radical things about the Constitution is there are no bans on immigrants to office holding, except for the president. And that's simply in order to not for the president to be in the thrall of a foreign power. I thought that was going to be a line. So that is a very unusual thing. And it's because like people like James Wilson, delegate from Pennsylvania, got up and said, yeah, I was born in Scotland, so I'm not going to sign this Constitution if I can't hold office. Like, this is a country that is founded. There's some quite stirring speeches that I make a point of hearing out. There are also some quite fascinating and unexpected moments of nativist fervor. My students always get a kick out of this, so I'll tell you this. But Samuel Morse, of Morse code. Morse code was designed to be a secret code cipher to be used only by the government to thwart what he believed to be a conspiracy of the Pope to destroy the country by sending Catholics over. So there's a lot of nativism in American history that's kooky and conspiracy-minded. It's a through line in American history. And then there are really huge demographic changes after 1965 and the Immigration Act of 1965 that I think liberals fail to be willing to look at and say, actually, we completely rebuilt the immigration regime in 1965 and there's never been immigration reform since then. And people who are upset about that have something to say and they need to be listened to. And there needs to be a conversation about a frank conversation. I don't think it's the divide of the electorate over the immigration question is an unsolvable problem. I think that the political gains, the short-term political gains that office seekers can get over stoking division on that issue are too tempting for them, and they have no sense of moral decency around what it means to the country to stoke up people's hatred of one another that way. So on either side. So thank you.
Thank you.
So you love history, I love history, we all love history. And we find ourselves now in a period of really stultified governance. I'm wondering where you could look to see an analogy and what some remedies might be suggested from this vast pool of knowledge that you've put into 1,000 pages.
Yeah, thank you. The two questions that I've been doing this for a couple weeks now. The book came out a couple weeks ago. The two questions that are always hardest are, who should we blame? And can you save us? I am interested in all of us thinking about where we are to blame. I am interested in the close your eyes and I'm a Catholic. So I'm all about the practice, the ritual. Close your eyes and think about the ways in which you have contributed to the screwed up nature of our country right now. I think you can probably think of a lot of things that you have done in your own life. Commit yourself to not doing those things. That's important. I really think that is important, as opposed to the who should we blame and can you save us? I totally get your question of what can we learn from the past about moments of similar challenge? And where I look to, partly because I just really love the 1930s, there's a lot of things I think are very groovy in the 1930s. There's incredible economic duress and economic suffering in the 1930s during the Great Depression, of course. There's also a terrifying sense that democracies are faltering and falling all over the world. And fascist regimes and authoritarian regimes and totalitarian regimes are on the rise. And one by one, you just kind of see these democracies fall. And Americans engage in an extended set of self-reflections. Intellectuals write all these essays on the future of democracy or when democracy fails, or there are all these tomes and there are Jeremiads and conferences and people get together and magazines run special issues. The New Republic runs this special series on the future of democracy, and everybody sort of thinks maybe democracy cannot survive mass society. That's sort of understood to be the problem. Mass society and the economic effects of mass society. And what's missing now that works then are public-spirited, especially artists and writers and playwrights and filmmakers, but also scientists who dedicate themselves to projects that are aimed at fortifying civic institutions and strengthening democratic traditions. I talked about some of these. I did this NPR interview a few weeks ago about these radio programs, most of which are funded by the Federal Writers Project, the WPA Federal Writers Project, and the radio division of that. But one of them was this long series called Americans All, Immigrants All, which each week on the radio was featured a different immigrant group and its contributions to American life. Another was this long series, I think a 27-part story called The Epic of America, which told all of American history as a celebration of the ordinary American and how ordinary people make a healthy politics possible, not elected officials. And one of which was this kind of amazing 1941 broadcast that was 1 hour that was done live the week after Pearl Harbor. It had been planned before then. And it was broadcast on all networks all at once. And it was basically all the major Hollywood stars. Jimmy Stewart was the main character. Lionel Barrymore was in it. Orson Welles was in it, and told the story of the Bill of Rights. And I did the story on NPR because I kind of wanted to say it was to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. This summer was the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment, which is our most important amendment. It bars discrimination by race, essentially, and also by implication by sex and by sexual preference. It is what guarantees us the equal protection and due process of the laws and extends the protections of the Bill of Rights to the states. Where was the asking Americans to think about and learn about and study and celebrate and commit ourselves to protecting and realizing the promise of the 14th Amendment? Millions of African people were killed because they were not protected by that amendment. That amendment made possible Brown v. Board to the degree that we have racial equality and racial justice in this country. It comes from that amendment. We spent the summer pulling down Confederate monuments. I don't think that's the answer. I think that might be my last question now. Thanks very much.
Great answer. Thank you.